control its enzyme production is now messed up, and one of the strange side effects of too many enzymes is increased pesticide resistance. However, normal mosquitoes without the disease are much healthier in the wild where there is no pesticide.
So it was a loss of information, but it was a benefit for those mosquitoes, right?
Well, they only benefit by being more resistant to the pesticide. The point is, by losing information, they lost control of an enzyme's production. Now, evolution needs to explain gains of information over time.
There's the rub. Creationists describe every genetic change as if it can only be a loss in information. They say that the deletion of a gene or the fusion of two chromosomes into one both count as a loss, but they will not admit that by that logic, duplication of genes or even whole new chromosomes in a controlled population would have to count as an increase in information. And technically, any information that is different from what it was becomes new information. But religious extremists, science denialists cannot be objective. They are not permitted to admit that this can even happen, even when it has been directly observed and documented dozens of times, wherein they can only make up excuses, like to say that the wild type of mosquitoes are much healthier, regardless whether there's any objective evidence of that or not. They won't give any metric for how to know whether information is gained as opposed to lost, because they know that as soon as they do, we will immediately present examples of that. And we already have done anyway, but they're not allowed to admit any of that, because they're holding to a belief system that requires that they make believe by whatever means necessary, even if that means deliberate deception.
And the same goes for other examples they give, like bacteria becoming more resistant, bone density, humans becoming more resistant to HIV.
And now I think John may be referring to my book, because I'm the only one I know of who's ever mentioned all of these things in one place, like becoming more resistant to HIV. In my book, I noted one example of benefit being the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, carried by about 10% of white Europeans. It appears to have become suddenly relatively common in that population about 700 years ago as a result of selective pressure applied by the Black Plague. And this mutation is reportedly harmless or neutral in every respect other than its one clearly beneficial feature. If one inherits this gene from both parents, they will be especially resistant, if not immune, to AIDS. And John mentioned bone density too, but he didn't even hint about what he was talking about there. And here's why. In my book, I also mentioned a family in Connecticut who have been identified as having hyperdense, virtually unbreakable bones due to a mutation causing increased LRP5 function. Now, some people with this type mutation also have deleterious side effects, but not the family in question, in which there were no associated symptoms at all, just a solid benefit with no downside. And creationists have tried desperately to find some fault with that, but there just isn't one, not with this family. Doctors have even described them as being superhuman in the sense that they have extraordinarily dense bones, the strongest bones on the planet, with no history of fractures, where one of them reportedly even survived a train crash inexplicably unscathed. And regarding bacteria becoming more resistant, the list of beneficial mutations one should normally find in any high school textbook includes adaptation to high and low temperatures by E. coli, as well as evidence of genetic divergence with beneficial mutations in bacteria, with some strains improving fitness in particular environments. But I went on to show the appearance of new and novel characteristics, such as nylon-eating bacteria. Nylon didn't exist before 1935, and there was never anything like it either. Not even the linkage of its subunits is found in nature. It is completely alien to this biosphere, and there was no organism capable of using the nylon as a food source. But after 40 years of chemical factories dumping nylon into the ecosystem, one or two strains of bacteria were discovered to have developed the ability to hydrolyze the new substance, thanks to a frameshift mutation. Again, creationists have tried their best to find some fault with that because they are forbidden to admit that any mutation could ever be beneficial. But all of their dishonest arguments against this reality have collapsed. We now have several examples of mutations throughout the animal kingdom and even in humans that are tied specifically to identified mutations that are not only beneficial, but that have resulted in novel function, what creationists would have to call an increase in genetic information, if they were honest enough that they could even admit the truth of the matter.
But if a population of creatures continues to lose information, could it be deadly for them?
Bingo! But here's the real problem.
The real problem is that populations are not continuously losing information. That's just another creationist straw man, being the only way they can account for the fact that every human zygote has an average of 128 mutations just to start with. Merely accepting that fact overturns all pretense of us having been created perfectly and impervious to genetic variation, especially when you understand anything about population genetics or the occurrence of uniquely distinct genetic markers or the founder's effect of genetic bottlenecks on migrants and so on, extrapolated back thousands of generations. Believers have to pretend that none of that is even real in order to make believe in what isn't real.
People count on that loss of information from mutations to create the genetic blueprint for every living creature on Earth out of nothing. That's crazy.
No way, that's so impossible. It destroys evolution.
Right?
That's why John told that lie. He wants to try and destroy evolution by lying about it, by pretending that all genetic variants, including novel traits and functions, came from nothing, when no biology textbook or professor teaching evolution ever said any such thing, because it is a lie, a straw man fallacy. Instead, what the textbooks really say is that mutations are the ultimate source of genetic change, with new alleles, new genetic information arising spontaneously to then become the raw material for evolutionary change. Evolution at every level is just a matter of incremental, superficial changes in physical or chemical proportions being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarities, which are how taxonomic clades are identified. Every trait that ever emerged was built upon a pre-existing precursory structure. Never has anything evolved out of nothing. But even when creationists know that, they will still never stop telling that lie, no matter how many times they're corrected. Because faith means convincing yourself of things that are not evidently true or even possible, and never admitting when you're always wrong about everything.
Okay, so what about the other changes? Program change, or you called it genetic recombination.
Look at what it says here. Most heritable differences are due not to mutations, but to genetic recombination. So God not only created all the animals, he also packed them with enough genetic information that would allow them to adapt to different environments and varieties we see today.
So why then did God cheat the cheetah? The genome and fossil record corroborate to show that cheetahs evolved in North America and that they are more closely related to the American cougar than they are to any of Africa's big cats. But when they expanded their range to Asia, Europe, and Africa around 100,000 years ago, they spread across those continents so fast, because they're cheetahs, they go fast, that the extremely wide range restricted their ability to exchange genes. Because exactly the opposite of what creationists pretend, animal populations actually depend on the continual change in genetic variation that ultimately comes from mutations. Instead of always degrading the genome, it's more like fine-tuning with minor adjustments, including frequent tweaks and occasional upgrades. Then, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, after the last glacial maximum, all the other cheetahs in the world went extinct, except for very few left in Africa that were already suffering from that earlier bottleneck of lacking genetic diversity. So ironically, it's almost like Jane said, that the loss of genetic diversity, having suffered 2 successive waves of these bottlenecks, has left the cheetah population severely compromised and susceptible to related illnesses. So the fact is, they are not packed with enough information to allow adaptation. That's not how that works. The only way to pack that information is through mutations being shared throughout the communal gene pool. Now, from a creationist perspective, this is a forbidden topic, because even just admitting that this can happen undermines their fable about all the animals coming off Noah's Ark 2 by 2. If that were so, then every species would be even worse off than cheetahs are now. This also presents an insurmountable problem for the fable of Adam and Eve. Remember that Francis Collins, who was an evangelical Christian as well as a geneticist, said that modern humans evolved from primate ancestors over 100,000 years ago, long before the Genesis time frame, and that our species originated from a population that numbered something like 10,000 people, not 2 individuals. He said that, unfortunately, the concepts of Adam and Eve as the literal first couple and the ancestors of all humanity simply do not fit the evidence. Because, he says with all of the authority of expertise, there is no way you can develop this level of variation between us from 2 ancestors. Remember that this is coming from a Christian who was also the head of the Human Genome Project. So he knows this subject and all of the relevant details much better than whoever the crackpot, know-nothing, science-denying liar was who wrote this script for John and Jane.
So adaptation is real?
Yeah, I saw an explanation of it in the Focus on Earth Science. Individuals with characteristics that are poorly suited to the environment are less likely to survive and reproduce.
Over time, poorly suited characteristics may disappear from the species.
John and Jane want to pretend that it's not evolution, it's just adaptation, refusing to admit that adaptation is an aspect of evolution, that it is variation provided by random mutations that are then pitted against natural selection, as would be expected in any dynamic environment in which there are fluctuations or extreme conditions. They just don't want to admit that adaptation is evolution because they're not allowed to admit evolution at all. Their faith will not allow them to call it what it is.
So a population of animals can adapt by expressing variety over time, but there are limits to how much they can change.
In what way?
Think about rolling dice. If you had 2 dice, you could roll anything between 2 and 12. The variety is programmed into the dice, but you can't roll anything higher or lower.
I get what you're saying. Likewise, animals can express a lot of variety, but there's a limit because of the finite genetic information they have.
Exactly.
John and Jane just completely ignored the fact that their textbook said there are 2 sources of genetic variation because they're not allowed to acknowledge the importance of mutation, which can even significantly broaden the information source for recombination, enabling a much greater range of change than John and Jane are permitted to admit.
And while we've seen some pretty amazing varieties within the kinds God created, like in dogs, one basic kind of animal can never change into another.
Which doesn't matter, because there was never any time in evolutionary history where one kind of animal was ever supposed to have given birth to or changed into another fundamentally different kind. That is a straw man fallacy, a deliberate distortion, misrepresenting evolution in a way that would actually violate multiple evolutionary laws, like the laws of biodiversity and monophyly, which is that one can never grow out of one's ancestor, because evolution is descent with inherent modification. That means that every new genus or species that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were, and the new variant still belongs to every ancestral clade that they did. The only definition the Bible gives for what a kind is exactly matches the biological species concept in relation to sexually reproductive animals, being whether 2 individuals can interbreed and bring forth fertile offspring after their kind. If they can, then they're the same kind/species. But then when speciation happens, when 2 descendant subsets of the same lineage have grown so far apart that they either cannot or will not interbreed under normal circumstances anymore, then they have become genetically isolated different species. This is the most significant division of all of taxonomy because the parent gene pool typically does more to inhibit new expression, such that the larger the population, the slower they evolve. But if you isolate smaller groups, then the expression of new variants arises more quickly and easily, and they evolve faster, especially when a new species emerges that is no longer constrained by the ancestral gene pool. Now, John and Jane admit that hundreds of breeds of domestic dogs were derived by artificial selection, taking advantage of genetic diversity that was not limited to recombination, but which produced varieties beyond that, requiring the additional influence of mutation. This is microevolution, variation within species. But they should also know that different species of dogs have evolved via natural selection, also taking advantage of that same genetic diversity provided by mutation, which is macroevolution. And this is why the genus Canidae doesn't work as a kind, because domestic dogs cannot interbreed with the African painted dog, or the Asian raccoon dog, or the South American bush dog. And most foxes can't interbreed either, certainly not with dogs, because they and many others are all different species that cannot interbreed to bring forth viable offspring anymore. That and dogs are morphologically comparable to fossil bear dogs and dog bears, as well as walking seals, transitional species for which there is a genetic link confirming common ancestry. And creationists changed their God's definition of kinds for 2 reasons that are both dishonest and stupid. And one is because the original belief was that God had created every species that there is, we have today, millions upon millions of them, exactly as they are now. But as we move through modern times, we got a better idea of the staggering diversity of life on every continent with unique forms on every island, they realized that there was no way that Noah's Ark could account for them all. And then if you add all the fossil forms we keep digging up, it got 100 times worse, especially trying to shoehorn all of those into a 6,000-year timescale. The only way they could save that fable was by accepting that evolution really happens, and not just microevolution either. They needed new species too, lots of them, in a hurry. And not just new species, but new genera, and sometimes even new families as well, and right away. The Noah's Ark story doesn't just require macroevolution, but a super-duper hyper-caffeinated electro-mega evolution happening in fast forward. Kind of like the way that John and Jane think that the supercontinent of Pangaea suddenly divided with all the continents rushing away from each other at freeway speeds, only to abruptly and inexplicably stop where they are now. Religious apologists concocted the notion that their God loaded some 1,400 original kinds onto Noah's Ark, these few species being the most generalized of primitive forms from which everything else evolved. Such that one pair of cats, for example, could instantly radiate like bacteria into all the various species we have today, plus many more that are now extinct, and they would have to evolve like that immediately because they already had lions, leopards, and house cats depicted in Egyptian hieroglyphs and such going way back, almost to the proposed time of the flood itself. And again, there are several definitely transitional species genetically linked to the wider categories of Phalloidea and the parent category of Carnivora, such that they cannot qualify as a kind. The other reason that fundamentalists changed their God's word as to what kind is so that they could have some bullshit excuse to deny whenever there evolved a new species of fruit fly or finch or COVID variant. Then they could say that it's still a fly, or it's still a finch, it's still bacteria, or whatever. It didn't turn into something else, which of course evolution wouldn't allow. That's not how descent with modification works. It's not like the wanna believers really care about the facts of reality, much less academic integrity. They can't admit what evolution is, so they made up something it isn't.
And that fits with all the examples we see in these textbooks.
Although they like to point out the differences in finch beaks and tortoises.
It's just adaptation within the genetic limits of that kind.
Right, but then they pass it off as evolution.
Because it is evolution, which is also defined as an aspect of population genetics, and allelic variance in reproductive populations over many generations. Even if there were such a thing as biblical kinds of animals, we would still be able to run genetic paternity tests to establish phylogeny. So yeah, you can lie about it all you want to, pretend it's something else if you have to, but it's still definitely, demonstrably evolution by definition.
And you know, I used to think that all these arguments really showed evolution, but then I got to thinking, studying changes in a beak shape, like Darwin's finches, won't show you where that beak came from.
Yes, it will. Beaks are relatively simple structures that have evolved independently in turtles, in pterosaurs, and in some dinosaurs, including birds, where the earliest representatives of all these groups originally had teeth.
And despite the minor changes, a finch is still just a finch.
And here John repeats the excuse that it's not evolution because it's still a finch, which is any of several hundred species within dozens of genera within a few different families of passerine birds, where nothing ever stopped being one kind or changed into a different kind. They're all still passeriforms, one of a few taxonomic orders of birds which are all still Maniraptoran dinosaurs. They didn't change from the dinosaur kind to turn into the bird kind. They're still the same kind they always were, they're just another variant of that. Because that's how evolution works. Descent with inherent modification, according to mutations leading to variation in alleles.
But the truth is what we read in Genesis 1:25. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good.
No, that is not the truth, because no part of that is true. The truth is what the facts are, and the fact is that life evolves. If there was a God, then we could accept the earlier verses where, God said, "Let the earth bring forth all of these things," because that's effectively true. I mean, apart from the fact that there's not a God, or at least, the earth actually, bring forth in one way or another. And we could even keep the original interpretation of kinds being very parallel to evolutionary phylogeny. After all, the Bible says there's all kinds of birds, and so we have kinds within kinds, just like we do in taxonomy. rather than having a created form that everything else evolves from, because then how could you have a kind within a kind? That's a contradiction. But as I said, there's evidently no God, and even if there was a God, we still have proof that evolution happens and that it's still happening, and that creation didn't happen. Not even micro-creation. Nothing in Genesis happened as described. So that is not the truth. Instead, it is a lie, one of many in a compilation that is full of it. Whether there is a God or not, the Bible has already falsified folklore either way, and not even the existence of God would change that.
So adaptations are kind of like the apps on your phone.
Yeah, I can't change a person into a puppy, but I can run the programming that's already on my phone.
Boy. Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
It makes me wonder why religious apologists constantly lie, not just to others, but to themselves as well, in defense of a faith that, on some level, the Wana believers must know is not really true. Yet they will use any and every falsehood or fallacy to fool themselves and others into believing it anyway. What causes such madness? And how can we cure it?
Enemy killing spree. Let's get in range. An enemy has been slain. Don't duck. Enemy rampage. An enemy has been slain. Your team has destroyed a turret. Your team has destroyed an inhibitor. Aced.
moments to time. If it's worth shooting once, it's probably worth shooting a lot. Where's the action? Sometimes outnumbered, never outnumbered.
You have been slain. Your team has destroyed an inhibitor. An inhibitor. Your team has destroyed a turret. Your team has destroyed a turret.